Hello all, welcome. We are going to give everybody a few minutes to get logged in. So just kind of hang tight for a little bit. Ooh, yeah. So as I said, welcome to the first faculty fellow lecture series for the fall semester. I typically like to give everyone until about 6:02, and then we will go ahead and get started. So welcome all, welcome. We're going to give everybody about another minute again, and then we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome all, welcome all. All right, it is 6:02. So hello and welcome to this evening's Zoom webinar that's being produced by the Honors College at West Virginia University. This event is the first faculty fellow lecture taking place this fall semester. These lectures are designed to allow each Honors College Fellow an opportunity to provide an inside look into the innovative course they are currently teaching within the Honors College and will be teaching next spring semester. I am Damian Clement, Associate Dean of the Honors College at West Virginia University. Tonight's lecture is entitled Material Texts by Dr. Adam Komisaruk. Dr. Komisaruk is a professor of English in the Department of English in the Eberly College of Arts and Sciences. We will follow our standard Zoom webinar format this evening. After this presentation, we will host an open question and answer session. Since we're using the Zoom webinar platform for this lecture, before we begin, let me review some of the features that will help you experience this evening's lecture in the best way possible. If you have issues with your audio or video at any point during the webinar, be sure to check your personal Zoom settings and your computer's volume control. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Due to enhanced security protocols, webinar attendees will not be able to see others' questions, only their own. To ask a question, you must click on the Q&A button. A separate screen will appear. Then you may type your question. The presenter will answer all questions live at the end of the presentation. If live captioning has been requested, it can be viewed by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If live captioning was not requested, a captioned version of this recording will be available at honors.wvu.edu. And now let's get started with this evening's lecture. So it is my pleasure to hand the floor, the screen, the mic, everything over to Dr. Komisaruk.
Thank you, Professor Clement. Thank you to the Honors College, and thank you to all of you for coming. I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see some images. I'll try to get this full size. There we go. And hopefully there will be no technical difficulties. I know that some of you out there may be in the class already, so if some of it is review or you've heard my spiel before, bear with me. But I look forward to your reactions and to your questions. So I thought I'd try to give you a sense of what we're trying to accomplish in this class and what some of the underlying principles of the class are. I would say that the main principle, the sort of operating idea behind the class is that books have never only been the words that they contain. Books are also containers. They are a medium, and they are a technology. And as such, they are material. We forge them out of the raw ingredients of our environment. We make paper out of old clothes or wood pulp. We make ink from iron sulfate or from growths on oak trees. We make bindings out of pigskin or calfskin, and so on and so forth. In turn, being material themselves, books have a very real physical impact on us. Reading books is a full body experience. They have texture, they have weight, they have a smell. Individually, we strain our eyes and necks and our hands in their service. They provoke laughter, they provoke tears, they provoke all kinds of emotions and other reactions. And on the social level, they can be revolutionary. Slavery was abolished in part because of a book, and the Holocaust happened in part because of a book. We're in a digital age now, which has reshaped these encounters, but it has not replaced those encounters. Because after all, what does digits mean? It means fingers and toes. The relation between the old and the new is always cumulative. It is never linear. So in the course, we will be critically analyzing texts, but we will also be dissecting and recreating books as objects. We'll be looking at the way that what we might think of as surface and depth, or form and content, or medium and message, these things are never mutually exclusive. They always are interdependent and shape one another. They are both indispensable. And I'm hoping that students in the class will kind of acquire these interpretive tools and skills that they can then use to apply to an information landscape in general that is growing more complex every day. As for what I'm going to ask of you in practical terms in the course, I'll get to that a little bit later. But let me just kind of give the sense of what the class is structured like and what some of the topics are that we're going to cover. So the first kind of section of the class deals with kind of the ingredients that make up a book, how it's made, how we get these raw materials. So we start with paper. We look at sort of the historical ways that it's been manufactured out of papyrus, out of animal skin, parchment, later out of rags from cast off linen or cotton clothing, and of course, most prominently now made out of wood pulp, out of cellulose. I tried my own hand at it a little bit using various materials to make homemade paper. We unfortunately don't have time to do it in class, although I am certainly going to provide lots of guidance as to how you might attempt that on your own. We also had a very interesting visit, and will again next term, from Annie McFarland, who is a professor in the College of Creative Arts, whose specialist is art therapy and has done some amazing work on handmade paper as a therapeutic tool in trauma recovery, grief counseling, palliative care, and things of that nature. She has talked about how she, talks to our students about how formerly incarcerated people will pulp their criminal records to make paper. About how veterans will pulp their old uniforms to make paper, and so forth. The idea is always that you are destroying something in order to create something new, to write a new story for yourself. It's quite powerful, I think. We talk about typography. We had a very nice visit and will again next term to Professor Joe Galbraith, who is in the graphic design department at the College of Creative Arts, who talked to us all about how type is made, who owns it in various printing shops, and how type isn't always what the writer Beatrice Ward called a crystal goblet, just a sort of transparent vessel that you use to get to the meaning of the words. Type itself is expressive. It signifies and it shapes the way we experience and sometimes the way we interpret a text. So I have an example here from an actual student of mine who just did a kind of experiment in setting a text in a type of their choosing. So they chose to set a stanza from Taylor Swift's song Lakes using two different typefaces. The one at top is called Eras, which creates more of a sort of modern effect because of things like its slight bias, it's being on a very slight angle, the fact that it lacks serifs, those little tails or feet at the ends of letters. Um, the A has an open bowl, right? It's not joined up with the stem, and the contrasting thickness of lines, like in the difference between the crossbar and the spine of the lowercase e. And then when we put it all together and kind of look at it at a bit of a distance, it has this kind of very kind of current, very much of the now effect, which, as my student pointed out, is complemented by the fact that Eras was also the name of Taylor Swift's recent tour. But then, as an experiment, they also set it in a different typeface called Bamberg, which is not only more severe, but also has a different kind of historical perspective, because Bamberg was invented around the year 1850. And 1850 was also the death year of William Wordsworth, the poet from the Lake District of northern England around Windermere, to which Taylor Swift refers in her lyrics. So that's a different kind of motive behind your choice of typeface, and not only a different effect, but has kind of, it comes with different baggage, different kind of resonances, not only aesthetic but also historical. So these are some of the ways in which typography is serious business. um we talk about the actual process of getting the words onto the printed page. So we look at the history of some different printing technologies, from the papyrus scroll to the wax tablet to the letterpress to the linotype machine, to the monotype machine, to the offset lithographic printing press, which, though invented at the turn of the 20th century, is still the dominant way that books are manufactured today. And we talk about, not only the technical side of it, but also how these different printing technologies make for different kinds of specialized labor, different speeds of production, and differently scaled economies, and even somewhat different reading experiences. Because if you have to unroll a scroll to a narrow piece of text that you can only see a bit at a time, that's going to sort of exercise your memory in a different way than if you can stick your thumb in one page and flip back to another page, or now if you can click on hypertext links. So, again, this is extremely influential. We talk about one aspect of the printing process called imposition, which means how the pages are laid out for printing on a single sheet of paper. So we talk about what are called different imposition schemes to produce books of different sizes or formats. I have students do kind of exercises in folding and cutting pieces of paper to see how this works, right? And that you have some decisions that you have to make as a printer. For example, are you going to print your pages in numerical order, or are you going to print them out of order? Are you going to print the same pages on both sides of the sheet of paper, or is each side of the sheet going to have different pages imposed on it? If you print the same pages on both sides of the sheet of paper, that means that you only need to use half as much metal type. And type is expensive and time consuming to set one piece at a time. So it economizes there. But if you print the same text on both sides of the printed sheet, it also means that you're going to eventually have to cut it in half, and the binder is going to have to bind twice as many copies at a time. So which approach you do depends on the economics of your printing house. It depends on the division of labor, and it depends on what kinds of costs you are willing to absorb yourself as opposed to pass on to the consumer. So again, these are important decisions. We talk about illustration. We just yesterday, in fact, we had a tour of some of the different techniques for producing reproducible images for illustrated books. Uh, Woodcut, line engraving, intaglio etching, lithography. Each of these techniques has a different character to it, a different process, different kinds of skill required, different advantages and disadvantages, both to the artist, to the printer, and to the reader. We also talk, we will be talking soon about the relationship between the word and image of a printed text. Illustrations are interpretations. They are not neutral. Sometimes they complement the words, sometimes they conflict with the words. Here you see an example of 3 different strategies that were used for illustrating the same poem from the mid-18th century by Thomas Gray, called Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat Drowned in a Tub of Goldfishes. On the left, we see a more or less contemporaneous version by Richard Bentley, which uses these almost sort of, these almost sort of classical, daisy, I'm trying to enlarge this, but I'm not, here we go. Uses these almost classical motifs featuring cats and mice in different dress and attitudes and postures, as well as kind of aquatic motifs, right? I think that's a net on the right. That might be Neptune here, or a water nymph, with the sort of a grandeur that befits the sort of tongue-in-cheek tone of this famous poem. A little bit later, we get this thoroughly bizarre vision by William Blake, who works in watercolor and who gives us this sort of strangely humanoid looking cat at the top and these kind of fanciful, almost water nymph-like creatures, which I assume are to represent the goldfish, in keeping with Blake's, highly imaginative, highly original vision that, more often than not kind of takes off in his own direction from anything suggested by the printed text. And then we have this sort of more whimsical recent version by Ken Ferguson that shows the cat sort of pre-drowning in more of a kind of domestic attitude. So, this is just sort of examples of how illustration can be quite innovative and quite multifarious. So we'll talk about this sort of thing. It is at this point in the semester that we will be reading Art Spiegelman's graphic novel Mouse, which, as you probably know, is the campus read this year, and which we can talk about in a variety of different contexts, including sort of how it works as a graphic novel, how it works as an example of particular choices about medium, visualization, and presentation of very difficult subject matter. We'll talk about binding. Um, this is, sort of an immense field. We will sort of not be able to do anything particularly complicated in class, but we will do a simple exercise with needles and threads and awls for puncture and different kinds of paper stocks, doing what is known as a pamphlet stitch or a pamphlet binding, just so you can sort of get a flavor for the process. And like many different aspects of the course, these are things that students may want to kind of explore in greater depth and with more specialized guidance on their own time, with an eye to their final project for the class, which I will talk about at the end. So we'll talk about some of the different techniques, the way that bindings have transformed books into spectacular works of art over the centuries, as well as raise kind of puzzling questions like, well, when is a book a book? And at what point is a book no longer a book? What are the different ways that the binding of a book can select for different audiences with different priorities? For example, here we see three different bindings of Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, one from the 18th century, one from the 19th century, one from the 20th century, and we can see how they sort of convey information about the priorities of the audience that is assumed for this book. Priorities having to do with affordability, with sort of utility, usefulness, scholarly sophistication and credibility, or simply kind of aesthetic display. Right? These are some of the decisions that have to be made at that level. And again, they are intimately intertwined with kind of very material realities concerning economics and circulation and things of that nature, as well as aesthetics. In the second major unit of the class, the second major block, we will be talking about what I call textuality, which has more to do with how the words of a book themselves are presented. Before movable type was invented, books were copied out by hand. But once movable type was invented, manuscript culture did not disappear. It survived. Again, the relationship between the old and the new when it comes to the history of the book is always cumulative. It is never linear. So even after printed books were available, we had people using their hands in a variety of what are sometimes called scribal cultures, a piece of antiquity surviving into the modern age. So, for example, up in the upper left-hand corner, we see an example of what was known as a commonplace book, which was a sort of journal or diary, usually sold with blank pages, sometimes made at home, sometimes made with sort of pre-printed margins that provided guidance as to what you might write in there. And the idea was that you would use it to record commonplaces, kind of little witty everyday sayings or pieces of contemporary life that you felt were worth remembering for one reason or another, whether that was because you were a budding writer yourself or because you felt that these were um, useful to your kind of moral and intellectual development, or for whatever reason, you would simply record them. So here we see an example from around 1600 of the writer Edward Pudsey, who decided that he was going to use his commonplace book to record, among other things, memorable lines from plays by Shakespeare that either he saw on the stage or read or both. And what he did was he sort of categorized them by keywords. So he used one section to record various places where Shakespeare refers to violence, another dealing with all his references to conceit or conceitedness, references to darkness, all of his quotations dealing with weeping, right? And these were the sort of the ways that Pudsey decided to sort of organize his commonplace knowledge for future reference. In the 19th century, Dorothy Wordsworth, the sister of William Wordsworth, the Windermere Lake poet, frequently accompanied her brother and their other family members and friends on these walking tours of England and Europe. And she kept extensive diaries of what she saw there, and eventually copied out those diary entries into these handsome volumes that she had bound, that she sometimes inserted into the midst of these engraved plates that she might have bought separately or gotten out of other books. Sometimes she encouraged other friends or family members to add material of their own. And although she didn't intend it for conventional publication, this was circulated um, among her inner circle, sometimes made multiple copies of, and for all intents and purposes was a book for circulation, even though it doesn't rise to our traditional understanding of what a codex, a bound volume is. And even though it exists only in manuscript form, in holograph, in the handwriting of the original author. And even in the present day, or close to it, we can see artists using their notebooks for this purpose, such as this extract from Ben Friedman, who taught at WVU for a long time and then bequeathed a lot of his material to the WVU Art Museum. And we can see how marvelous some of these pages are, with various media, including pastel, ink, and even duct tape. There's page after page of this kind of thing. If you yourself are writers or artists, you very well may keep journals or notebooks, thereby keeping scribal manuscript cultures alive. In our unit on textuality, we're also going to talk about, oh, sorry, this should say something else. This should say editing. Um, we need to talk a little bit about the challenges that sometimes face editors, and in turn, scholars and readers, both professional and amateur, when they are confronted with a text that exists in multiple versions. So here I give the example of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which she first composed in a series of manuscript notebooks. These notebooks were then corrected and at times revised by her husband, Percy Shelley, whose handwriting you can see in darker ink, and which in the transcription to the right is indicated by the darker print as opposed to the lighter print, which is crossed out or X'd out, indicating what Mary Shelley originally wrote. Okay. This corrected manuscript was then converted into what is called a fair copy, which is a kind of clean holograph version in handwriting, which is then intelligible enough to be presented to the printer for publication. That then wound up as the first edition of 1818, which is largely identical to the fair copy, but which is not completely identical to the fair copy, much less to the original manuscript version. And then went through a couple more editions, and then was published in the third edition of 1831, which made further changes, including replacing the phrase "modeled my feelings," which exists in all three previous versions, with the word "molded my feelings." Now, which of these is Frankenstein? Where is Frankenstein? If you're going to be producing a reliable edition of Frankenstein, are you going to go with the first version? That is to say, the notebook manuscript version? If you go with the manuscript version, are you going to go with the very first thing that Mary Shelley wrote? Or are you going to go with the changes that were made by Percy Shelley? If subsequent editions made further changes, do we accept those as sort of the more authentic versions of Frankenstein? Or are they less authentic in the sense that they are getting farther and farther away from the original source and therefore have the potential to be introducing more and more errors or more and more changes that were not authorized by the writer? It's very possible that the publisher of the third edition changed the word modeled to the word molded because they assumed that Shelley could not possibly have meant modeled my feelings. That doesn't seem like a real idiom. She must have meant molded. But all of the other manuscript evidence suggests that no, she did mean modeled. And in fact, she's using the word modeled in a way that it would have been used in the 18 teens, even though it's not really used that way anymore. So these are the kinds of questions that we have to ask. There are some very good reasons to prefer later versions. There are some very good reasons to go back to the earliest available version, but that too depends on who your audience is, how much money you're willing to invest in the process of preparing a text, and what your sort of belief system is about what constitutes an author's intention, right? Which sometimes not even authors know for sure. They change their minds. Okay, so these are the kinds of things, and we're not even getting into the much later sort of afterlives of Frankenstein, from the stage productions, which were almost simultaneous with the original publication of the novel, or their adaptations in Hollywood films. So we'll talk about kind of the kinds of questions that we have to ask about the textuality of a text. And I will have students try their hand at kind of preparing an edition of their own, not of Frankenstein, but of a small text, most likely a short poem by Emily Dickinson, and, see what kinds of decisions you end up making. There's also the question of the transmission of a text, because every time a book passes through a different person's hands, it has to come to terms with different interests, different values, different priorities, and very often passing through all of these different hands, which the book historian Robert Darnton famously mapped out in what he called the communications circuit, will often create competing versions of what a book like, say, Frankenstein is. And those competing versions may have to do with not just different cosmetic qualities of the book, but also different textual qualities of the book. Not only, when it comes to a single word like modeled versus molded, but even when it comes to entire chapters being missing or included in some cases. Every cook is going to add to the broth a little bit differently. And one thing that I'm going to have students in the class do is to pick a book of their own and sort of write its biography a little bit, to sort of retrace the process by which it finally comes into their hands, as much as they are able to do, given the sort of information available. This is bound up with kind of the changing face of the book business itself. The roles of author, editor, publisher, printer, bookseller, and everything else converge and diverge, and then converge and diverge again at various points in time and in various places around the world. We'll talk about how that can sometimes work. We'll talk about the way that now the publishing industry has become highly consolidated and highly corporatized, and how that affects what we have available to read and in what ways, and what we may not have available to read in what ways. We'll talk about changing ideas of intellectual property, of copyright, of piracy and theft, which is something that lots of authors are very concerned about. We'll talk about the rise of self-publishing through online platforms like Amazon and others. And we will have a visit from a real live editor at the Real Live West Virginia University Press, who will come in to talk to us about some of the realities and the challenges of academic publishing today. And then this sort of leads into the third sort of movement or major section of the course, which I call the book in society. And here we will be examining how we interact with books, how they affect us, both personally and in the wider world or worlds of which we are a part. For a long time, people have dreamed of what's sometimes called the universal library, an institution that could contain all of the world's knowledge. And this dream, in a sense, has never really gone away, even though we have confronted its possibilities or its impossibilities at various times. We are going to make a series of site visits to local libraries, including an academic library, right, the downtown library here at WVU. We will be visiting the public library in downtown Morgantown, and we will also be visiting within the downtown library the special collections, the rare book room at the WVU Regional History Collection. As I tell my students, this is not going to be your typical sort of orientation to your friendly neighborhood library. We're going to be looking more sort of critically at the library as an institution, thinking about things like, what exactly is the expertise of a librarian? How do you sort of why is this not something that just anybody can do, but it is a kind of specialized knowledge? How do various kinds of libraries go about organizing knowledge or organizing information? How do they make decisions about what to acquire, what to keep, what not to keep, what to get rid of? What purpose do libraries serve in the different communities of which they may be a part? And why are libraries still necessary in an age where everything seems to be online, right? These are some of the things that I'd like those with experience in the field to sort of explore with us. And for a sort of small exercise, I'm going to have students sort of imagine the library of the future, what it might be like, both, physically, kind of organizationally, technologically, and sort of philosophically. Um, Books do make history. Um, Now, um, we have an example of this happening in real time. Whatever your politics may happen to be, whatever you think about J.D. Vance, there is no denying that he is the author of a book that is potentially affecting the course of history. And this is happening before our eyes in real time, right? Where he rose to prominence first as a best-selling author, then as a senator from Ohio, and now finally as a candidate for vice president of the United States. By coincidence, this semester, our unit on books making history will fall 4 days before the presidential election. Didn't plan it that way, but that's how it's going to turn out. So, again, we will look at the sort of way in which we'll read selections from Hillbilly Elegy. We'll look at ways that it has been responded to, including some very critical essays in this collection called Appalachian Reckoning, uh, and the way that the book was covered in the national press in ways that connected directly to the formation of Vance's public profile. Right. Um, so this is something that I think we cannot deny is happening in real time, whatever your particular political allegiances or opinions may or may not be. I want to be very clear about that. Um, um, we'll talk about sort of the way books also can change lives in the context of social justice, right? We censor books, we ban books, we even burn books, and books can change people's lives. We are going to read about this in a historical context, and we are also going to visit the home on right in downtown Morgantown of the Appalachian Prison Book Project, which is now in its 20th year of operation. It serves 6 states around the region, and it provides printed matter to incarcerated persons with an eye to bolstering education and preventing recidivism. It sends out books by request, and it also sponsors book clubs within prisons. Um, it receives approximately 200 requests per week, and in the 20 years of its operation has filled approximately 70,000 of those requests. It's really quite a remarkable project. We have here just some sort of collage of some of the different letters that were received from incarcerated persons by the APBP, and which gives you a sense of the range of the material for which they are hungering. So we will visit them and sort of have them talk to us about their operation. And then, finally, I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about reading. What exactly happens when we read cognitively? What are our processes of attention, of comprehension, of recollection, right? How have these been studied by scientists of human cognition? What are the somatic dimensions of reading? How does reading affect our bodies? And what are the kinds of traces little bits of ourselves that we leave behind in books, right? So we have examples here from a project at the University of Virginia called the Book Traces Project, which has an online archive that anyone can contribute to, and which I'm going to encourage my students to contribute to. Sometimes people write their own poetry in the flyleaves of books. They press flowers in them. Sometimes they make modifications, not only leaving marginal annotations, but redactions, for example, in this image on the right, which appears to have been prepared for a stage production of the play that has been published in this book. So certain things are going to belong, certain things aren't. You need to sometimes cut things out in the interest of time, etc. There are also some very strange ways that we have of interacting with books. For example, there was a process that gained traction in the 19th century known as Grangerization or extra illustration, where you would sort of take a published book and then you would thicken it out with material of your own, whether by pasting in photographs or maps or illustrations or pages torn out of other books, let alone whatever annotations you might want to scribble in the margin. And sometimes, you can't see it in this example, but when closed back up, these books would swell to several times their original size. But this was a practice that was encouraged and which I'm going to actually invite my students to experiment with a little bit themselves. And then, things even get even crazier with practices such as bibliomania, that is to say, the obsessive collecting of books, which was famously diagnosed in a book published in the early 19th century by Thomas Dibdin. A practice known as bibliomancy, which basically is divination or sort of fortune telling through opening a book at random. The most famous example of this in literary history is Saint Augustine, who describes in his Confessions having spent one afternoon in his garden and hearing an angelic voice saying, "Tolle lege, take it up and read," meaning take up the Bible and read it. And he flipped to a random section of the Bible which contained a verse cautioning him to give up his sinful life and walk in the path of God. And from then on, he says, he was on a path to spiritual righteousness that had been unknown to him in his dissolute youth. There's also something known as bibliophagy, which is actually eating books. Something that we see a medieval manuscript here mentioning in the case of the prophet Ezekiel. There are actually several examples of this in the Bible, as well as from later periods. What does this mean? Why do this? What does this tell us about our relationship to particular texts and to books in general? And as I said, I'm not going to force anybody to eat something against their will, but I would, I'm going to invite them to sort of play with some of these different experimental forms of interaction. So we're going to have these short exercises distributed throughout the semester, but then this is going to culminate in a final project for the semester in which I'm going to ask everybody to make a book of their own. And I say make a book because they may or may not decide that they want to use a text that they have written themselves. They can, but they don't have to. This book can take any number of forms, right? It can be a handcrafted artisanal codex. It can be a print-on-demand Amazon title. They can create a hypertext that they annotate digitally. They can write a Twitter novel. They can prepare their own edition of a classic text. However it is that they feel they can best express themselves and capitalize on the skills that they have acquired or would like to acquire over the course of the semester. Uh, if my students are not confident that they have the time or the technical expertise to produce a physical artifact, I understand that. They may want to try their hand at making their own paper. I've even had a student some years ago in a different class who decided to print her own movable type using a 3D printer and then made a letterpress out of one of those caulking guns from the hardware store. You don't necessarily have, it took her the whole semester. You don't necessarily have to go that far. If you want to, kind of play with it, by all means. If you feel that you are interested in some of the techniques that we looked at earlier in the semester, but you feel you need a little bit more guidance, I can definitely set you up with an appropriate person to give you the guidance, whether that is me or someone who has been one of our guest visitors throughout the semester. But if none of that is something you feel confident, I will accept a sort of prospectus, a written document explaining how you would like to do this particular project if you had the time the materials and the technical capabilities. So sort of a, a kind of, not a blueprint necessarily. It doesn't even necessarily have to be visual, but a kind of descriptive statement. And whether this takes a physical form or merely a narrative form, your project will be accompanied by a maker's statement, a sort of reflection on what you did, how you made the choices that you made, what you were trying to accomplish by doing this, and how you feel it worked out. And then everyone will sort of have a chance to share the uh, the results for better or for worse with their classmates. And again, my criteria is not going to be how technically adroit you are, because it's not that kind of class, right? It's not even an English class, technically. This is an interdisciplinary course in the Honors Foundation program that I hope is going to attract people from all different disciplines with different kinds of interests, different kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of passions, and different kinds of skill sets that they bring to the table and are interested in developing. So I'm hoping that, you will kind of draw on your strengths in that way. And it's the process and the reflection on the process that I value the most highly rather than the end product. Because one thing that I think becomes abundantly clear the more time you spend with the material aspects of texts is how fallible we really all are. So thank you very much for your attention. That's sort of the end of my formal presentation. I'll stop my screen share and I'm happy to sort of take questions um, and field them as well as I can try to do.
Thank you very much, Adam, for the insightful presentation. So, attendees, now it's your time. If you have any questions, we have the chat open. Is it the chat or the Q&A? It's one of them. Click the Q&A, actually. The Q&A is open if you want to ask any questions about the class, any questions that Dr. Komisaruk can answer with regards to the class. That's a really interesting presentation, Adam. I didn't, let's see, I see a couple questions in here. What's your favorite book?
Oh my gosh. Ah, there's so many. Um, I've had a long time. Oh, I can't possibly answer that question. I will say that I've had a long time passion for the works of William Blake, who was a poet of the late 18th, early 19th century, who I showed you his kind of weird fanciful illustration to the Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat poem, who was trained as a visual artist, as an engraver, who produced his own books in multimedia formats. He engraved copper plates using acid, inked them, printed them, and then hand colored each copy with watercolors. They are spectacular objects, and their sort of poetic vision, which attempts no less than the story of how the universe was created, how humans fell from grace, and how they will be redeemed, just never ceases to open up kind of imaginative worlds, and which has become a long time kind of companion of mine. So,
Uh, Good job. Adam, there's a question here. I feel like I could look this up, but I'm sure you might know it off the top of your head. Does the class fulfill a GEF? If so, which one?
that would, I think, be a question for Professor Clement. I
I think
honestly don't
I
know
think it's
how
6. I
it
feel like it's
does.
6.
That's right. Yeah, it does fulfill GF.
I
Yes,
think it's 6.
this particular one, which
I
is
think
the
it's
sort of
6.
humanities slot for the honors courses.
Yeah.
Um, fulfills the arts and creativity, I think is what it's called.
Yep, I feel
GF.
like that's what it's called. I will look it up and get that answer to whomever asked that question. What's your least favorite book you have to cover as part of the course?
As part of the course, um, I hope that we're not going to be looking at any that I actively dislike. Um, I will say that we're going to be looking again, this isn't an English class, although I'm an English professor. We will be looking very closely at a lot of texts, but not always in the way, not always in their entirety, and not always as a kind of organic works of verbal expression, which is the primary way that I would approach these same books if they were in an English class. So, there are a handful of assigned texts for the class, but we will be reading most of them through excerpts or looking at them maybe in slightly different ways than you are accustomed to looking at books. We're accustomed to looking through books, right? To looking through the medium at the words they contain. We are, going to be doing a lot of looking at books as opposed to strictly looking through them. So we are going to be concerned with the words. We are going to be talking a lot about the texts, the verbal art, but in a different context and through a different kind of set system of relationships than we would be doing if this were a literature class. So I hope that everything will be at least reasonably interesting. I don't necessarily expect that you will like everything we do, but I hope that there will be enough variety in the class that if you're not sold on a particular thing, we'll move on to something else before long. And then you will have the opportunity to engage at a more leisurely pace with a single volume of your own devising for the final product. So I don't
Okay,
know if that's sort of what kind of answer you were looking for, but you know, I that would be sort of my take on it.
okay, Adam, here's what. We have about 6 questions and we have about 3 more minutes left. So I'm
Okay,
just going to give you some rapid questions and you give some rapid answers
I'll
so we
do
can
my
try to get
best.
you. Okay, what exactly does textuality refer to? Is it the specific fonts that writing is done in?
No, it refers to the communication of the way in which the words of a book are presented. It's a way of making decisions about what the author said. Because as we see in an example like the text from the excerpt from Frankenstein, there is no single answer as to what Mary Shelley wrote when she wrote Frankenstein. And there's no easy answer as to which version of those words we are to regard as representing what the author intended. So these are they're more kind of editorial problems than problems of physical appearance, which is what the first section of the course is about.
Okay, I got 2 more questions I'm going to ask you because I think these are 2 really good questions. What are students expected to gain from this class, or how could any major apply the things gained from this course to their future careers? And who do you recommend take the class? Great question.
Um, I think that one of the underlying principles of the class is that any information that we have, any knowledge that we have, is always mediated. It never comes to us direct. It always has to pass through some kind of vessel, some kind of system of transmission. And that transmission is material, and it has material dimensions and interested parties, and that presentation, that mediation affects our experience of it. And this is true whether we're talking about a novel, whether we're talking about a math textbook, whether we're talking about a podcast. So I'm hoping that through this class, people, regardless of their interests and background and major and career plans, are going to be sort of more critical, more mindful, sort of members of the communications circuit in which we are all participating.
Okay, and this is the final question, a really good question to end it. Do you find that students gain a greater appreciation for physical books after this class rather than the online service books like on Kindle?
Yes, but one of the things that I want to stress in this class and in general is that digital books are not immaterial. They are they are sort of, they have a place, they have physical dimensions, they have economic relationships behind them. They affect us cognitively and sort of somatically, right, in our minds and in our bodies. It's a different kind of experience, but it is nevertheless highly physical. Um, and, what I always say is that, we can still read a print book that was made 600 years ago, but try reading a book from a computer diskette from 10 years ago, and it's lost forever. So that just shows you that no matter whether we're talking about analog or digital, whatever medium we're talking about, there's always that highly material, that highly physical dimension. It exists in time and space, and it affects our minds and it affects our bodies, just as it is affected by the minds and bodies of those around it.
Wow. Well, Adam, thank you. We appreciate the
These are
opportunity to
great
visit.
questions.
Oh, yeah,
I'm
these I
happy
am.
to
Ooh,
talk to you more about this. Email
ooh,
me
yep.
through the English department. Come by. I'm happy to talk to you anytime, and I
Wow.
hope I'll be seeing uh, many of you again soon.
This was good.
Thanks for this
So
opportunity.
we appreciate the opportunity to visit with you this evening. If you have any additional questions about the course, please feel free to reach out to Dr. Komisaruk. Email address is akomisar@wvu.edu or through the English department. An archived version of this webinar will be available later on the Honors College website. Thank you, everyone, for spending your evening with us. Thank you again, Adam. Everyone,
Thank you,
please have a
Professor
good
Clement, and
afternoon.
thank you to all of you for coming.
Okay, bye-bye, all.
Um,
I can do this.
are you going to close this
Yep,
out?
I'm going to close this out here now.
Okay.